Hello, and welcome to All the Grief, a regular podcast for all those who have been touched by grief. We are your hosts. I am Rebecca Luttrell.
And I'm Andrea Mathern.
We are two friends, a therapist and a social scientist, both highly sensitive fellow grievers, here to share our hearts as we talk about all the grief. Quick note for our listeners, there are a couple of sound issues in this episode, and we did our best to edit them, but there were some we had to leave in. Just want you to know it's not your headphones, it's not your speaker, and it doesn't last very long, but hopefully the content was important enough that it's okay that we kept that in. And welcome. Hi, Andrea.
Hey, Rebecca.
How are you today?
Good. I don't know if anybody else felt this. We're recording this sort of at the turn of the new year, and there has been some energetic shifting. About to sound super hippie, but man, I came into the winter solstice and I was just intention setting, and I felt like the world was my oyster. And then I don't know, something turned on its head at the beginning of January. But luckily, I feel like I'm kind of coming out of that space. It felt like a 180. Everything was coming up roses, and then suddenly, not that anything went particularly bad, but I felt just this energetic shift that felt less in my favor. And but I feel like I'm coming out of it. I'm feeling much more optimistic and hopeful, and my heart is super grateful. So yeah, I'm in a good place, but it's been a little bit of a roller coaster ride energetically.
Yeah.
How's your heart today? How are you?
You know, that feels really relatable. I will own some of my witchiness and hippiness. We just were together right in the beginning of the year, and you had this beautiful deck, and I decided to pull one card on the way out, and I was like, yeah, no, I don't like that card. I'm going to try again. And then I tried again, and I was like, cool, I got the Tower card twice. And so it feels like that moment that I'm in of just some things falling apart. And that's what happened, what came. And it feels like I actually energetically, internally feel things shifting, where I have an incredible amount of creative energy coming through. And despite everything feeling like it's kind of hard around me. So I'll take it. I'll take it.
Beautiful. Yes, let's ride that.
Yeah. All right. So today our topic is estrangement grief, and we have a guest, Willow Meili. And Willow is a good friend and holds all these sort of titles in the world. So she's a grief tender, a death worker, hospice volunteer, a mother. She spent the last 9 years studying and exploring the lived experience of what does it mean to live in relationship with grief due to death and non-death losses, which I think is so important because we, so often think of grief only related to death. She's the co-founder of the Grief Well, which offers support for people living with grief through different things that bring people together to be with grief and explore what it means to have these relationships with grief. She believes we're all grievers, which you are among friends on this podcast. We are all grievers, and that we all experience grief-worthy losses that go beyond death losses. I know Willow as a person who has this gift of holding the paradox of the human journey and just likes to be vulnerable with other vulnerable humans. And so that is part of why Willow is here today. But that she has a special connection and has done, presentations on estrangement grief, has things to share with estrangement grief. And I love this topic. So Willow, welcome.
Hi, Willow.
If you want to just start with where you are today.
I'm doing pretty well today. My family just adopted a new puppy, so I feel like I'm in that baby phase again.
Oh, sure. Right.
I'm up in the middle of the night and all the things, but I'm loving it. I'm finding so much joy in walking outside at 3 a.m. and looking at the stars and just loving watching my family fall in love with this little creature. So my heart is actually feeling very full and just expansive today.
Awesome. Oh,
Which
that's
is
so
really nice.
beautiful.
Yeah, it feels good. Yeah.
I also, our dog is 2, and I loved it too. And so it's so wonderful how quickly they evolve, more quickly than human babies. So it's like you can enjoy the baby phase, but it really is very short.
Yes, I just said to my husband last night, I feel like it's a mix of infancy and toddlerhood all at the same time. You know?
Totally.
And I like it. Thank you so much for having me and being willing to talk about this topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about estrangement grief. Like,
Okay,
set the
yeah.
tone. Yeah.
Yeah, I will. I have a couple of definitions that I like to work together. Estrangement grief, it's a label that I personally didn't find until a couple of years ago when someone sent me an article, a really beautiful article written by a woman who was going through the death of her father, who she was estranged with. And I just was so captivated by the complexity of that. But when she was describing estrangement, I had this like very big awakening around the fact that I was actually living in some estrangement relationships, but I wasn't labeling them as such. And so it was a very similar feeling to when I really woke up to my experience with grief being more than just around death. So estrangement is defined as, it's in our culture, our so-called culture here in the West, it's all based around family, but you can be in estranged relationships with more than just your family, right? But it's all based around the idea of the nuclear family. When you go into estrangement, meaning you stop speaking to, relating with, being in contact with one of your family members. And this can happen for all kinds of different reasons. One of the biggest reasons that I've been reading about in my research is abuse, mental illness, addiction. And a lot of times estrangement happens not by choice. It's out of necessity, or it just happens naturally over time, especially when things like mental health and addiction are the pieces of it. But as we know, relationships between people are very dynamic, and estrangement can be something that we flow in and out of as well. So it's not really this like fixed thing that happens. And in my personal lived experience, I witnessed estrangement occur between a sibling and a parent for over 10 years. And I was sort of stuck in the middle of that. And that was a really interesting place to be. And I really struggled in that, to be honest. And it was filled with grief because I just wanted the two family members to reconcile. Like, I just wanted there to be peace between them, and it wasn't possible. I think that part of why we don't talk about estrangement is because in our, again, society, we put the nuclear family at the top of this pyramid as it's the end all be all. And so people feel a lot of shame around not having good relationships with their family members. And we know you're born into your family. You don't get to choose. Right. And some of us, it's a great pairing. And for others of us, it isn't. And for some of us, it's great up until a certain point. And then it's not anymore. So it's a really dynamic and interesting thing that happens in our relationships. So,
yeah. Well, and so this idea of estrangement grief, was this a pre-existing topic that you came into, or did you sort of coin the phrase as you were exploring?
I didn't coin the phrase. No, when I started researching and typing into Google estrangement grief, there's definitely counselors and therapists out there that talk about it. It was interesting to me, though. I looked at a bunch of books on estrangement, but I didn't feel connected to them because they were based around the idea of the adult child being estranged from the parent. And they were books mostly written about how to deal with that as the parent.
Mm.
And a lot of them focused on repair.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't feel a deep connection to that.
Mm-hmm.
But then I went on to find some websites that used a lot of phrases and talked in a way that I really connected more with, because people were talking more about how this isn't just in the context of the adult child and the parent.
Mm-hmm.
In my personal experience, that is my main estranged relationship. I am living in an estranged relationship with my father,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't mean that we're completely no contact. So it's really
Nuanced.
it's so individual, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't coin the term, but I love the term because I think that when we can find language that helps us connect with our lived experience, especially when it comes to grief, that really helps us. It helps us in our healing, and it helps us in our relating with grief and learning to live with grief. You know, as you mentioned in the beginning, my philosophy and feeling around grief is that it's here to stay for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about death. There are many losses that we go through in life that are grief worthy. And so when we can learn to be in relationship and kinship with our grief, then we're able to live a more dynamic life because we're in touch with our emotions. We're on our healing journey, not as a destination, but healing as the journey
Mm-hmm.
itself. Because life it's like the ocean. It's sometimes the surf is amazing and other times it's awful and it's tossing us around and we're falling off our surfboard. And so I think being able to define the different kinds of grief that we're experiencing is really important
Mm-hmm.
to being able to identify with what's going on inside of us and around us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do want to go back to something that you said about the pedestal in Western culture about the nuclear family, and something that resonated with me. We are born into these families, and sometimes it's a great fit and sometimes it isn't. And I'm Latina, and generally, our sort of Latino culture is a lot less nuclear. Like, we are very multi-generational and they're very big families, but it is family above all. And I think sometimes that same pressure of like family above all impacts the way that estrangement may need to happen
Mm-hmm.
for a healthier subunit of that very large family system for an individual. Or I think the other thing that it brought up for me was when estrangement does happen of an individual, it's written off. It's like that person does not exist anymore. And then there becomes this sort of unaddressed hole or gap within that sort of larger family unit of, we know they're missing, we know they're gone, we know that the reasons why they've kind of been pushed into the shadows. And that's this other layer of grief and misunderstanding that I think we carry with us. So I'm fascinated, is the long and short of it.
Yeah, so I can speak to that just from my own lived experience. When my brother and father stopped speaking and went into estrangement, that is now, I think it's like 13 years they haven't talked to each other. When they stopped speaking, I watched. My father is one of 5 children, so we have sort of a larger family on his side. And I watched my aunts and my uncles and my grandmother and even myself, like, why don't you just make up with dad? It'll be fine. Just make up with him. It's fine. You guys are both being stubborn. But it was deeper for him. It wasn't just about the argument that created the estrangement. It was about all the other stuff that was going on, not being tended to. No one was doing their personal work around it.
Right.
And so it built up and built up. And then when the reason for the not speaking to each other happened and it blew up, my brother, I think, and I can't fully speak for him, and I feel very sensitive to really going deeply into the story, but
Sure.
I watched him really battle with that inside because he felt the pressure of the larger family that really was just brushing the conflict and what led to the conflict off and just telling him to get over it and make up with his father.
Mm-hmm.
while no one was really saying that to my father, where he was the adult in the situation, and my feelings were really like, come on, this is your son,
Right.
you know? And obviously, like I said, there's a lot of deeper stuff going on there. But when I started learning more about estrangement, I was like, wow, this must happen so much as well, where when someone becomes estranged or two people become estranged, the pressures that they feel from the rest of the family, the
Sure.
shame, the guilt, like all of that, it's so complex. In my brother's case, like they are completely cut off. And so it's like either it can be either this deep cutting off, never speaking again. How will this ever repair? It might not. Or in my case, with the estrangement, while I don't speak to my father, which isn't my choice, I hear about him through my stepmother. So I get these like nuggets. So I still know about him. It's so painful, but I'm not speaking to him directly.
Wow.
And so I think, again, when it comes back to the grief, it's like we are living with the loss of people who are still alive is something else. It really is, because they're here. They're on planet Earth. You know, for some people, they're literally in the same town. I live in a completely different country than my family, you know, so I have this distance piece. But for some people, they run into their estranged family member at the grocery store or at an event or whatever. And so I just, again, as we know, our grief is so individual. And I also think this experience of estrangement is just so individual and difficult, you know, for so many reasons.
Absolutely. I just started this book, and it's by a grief researcher. She's a clinical psychologist, I think. The part that I've been really thinking about a lot was she talks about our initial attachment and how we attach, and there are these tethers. And I think about becoming a mom and just this intense connection that I had immediately with these tiny human beings. And even though I didn't really understand the brain chemistry of attachment, it was there. And she talks about it like our brain's kind of inability to understand when someone dies. Our brain can't really process because we're so pattern oriented. And so it takes a long time for our brain to realize like they're not there anymore. So I've been thinking about that while you were talking. You have these patterned connections, right? Like you have these attachments to these people and they're gone from your life. Your brain is trying to like put together, but they are there. You know, you don't even have the reality of they're physically gone, you know, which I think helps us integrate grief when somebody passes, but must make the integration of somebody who's still alive just that much more complicated.
Yeah, it really does. I resonate with that. My father just celebrated his 72nd birthday last week, and his birthday's a really hard day. It feels like a death anniversary for me because all I want to do is talk to him, you know, and I think about him all day, and I'm just like, oh my gosh. And this year, my stepmother sent me a photo of him, and that was really hard for me to see him. But I'm glad that she did, because as much as it's hard, I'm also like, I want that, you know? And I have my practices that I do to sort of alchemize the grief in my body that I feel on that day. And my daughter, who knew him as a baby, we spent time with him when she was tiny up until she was 4 years old, and we'll talk about him and I'll tell stories about him. So there's ways that I soothe that, but yeah, it is really interesting to feel those feelings. And I think a lot of people are living with that, particularly whether they would label it estrangement, but like, you know, folks who have people in their family who are going through addiction and things like that, mental health issues where there is separation, or they're not able to be in contact with them, or whatever the situation is. I think a lot of people are actually grieving the losses and the separation from people who are still alive, whether they would use the term estrangement or not.
Sure.
But I do think that is a very common grief that people are carrying for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting because when you brought the topic up, I have not heard that pairing
Yeah.
of estrangement grief, and I was thinking about it. And I think the way that I mainly came in contact with even the concept of understanding estrangement was in my graduate program. We did genograms where you kind of do your family tree, but it's a very psychological family tree. So you trace back a few generations and then you have certain symbols that you do. And so there's a symbol that represents cutoff. And it's when someone's been cut off, either they have a cutoff in their relationship or maybe it's a complete cutoff from the family. And I only had that experience when people got divorced, that there was
Yeah.
like that experience.
Sure.
But I never really, and this is what I said at the time, I was like, I don't do cutoff. Like, I don't, I'm a person who's so relational. I'm the person who would be like, we have to figure this out. And only recently in my own life did I end up in a situation where I actually had to do cutoff with someone. And it is not my nature. And it's sort of like what you were talking about. I think the grief for me is feeling like the preciousness of a human life and that we are both humans on this planet right now with a similar lifespan, and I don't see how that we would ever have relationship or contact again, but that we have, there's a history, there's things that we share, that it would, in some ideal part, like the part that longs for a different reality, it could be really lovely. And I also having to accept it can't happen, and there's a toxicity and a pain there that I'm not willing to live with anymore, and that it's a pretty big deal that I'm more comfortable doing cutoff than pursuing the relationship. So I'm just curious, like, how that comes up.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just spoke to was boundaries. Like
Oh,
having
is that what they're
boundaries.
calling them? Yeah.
That's what they call them now. And I mean, I know it's another very popular buzzword right now, and it's being thrown all around. But for me, I rode the trip of my father and brother are estranged. I'm the oldest sibling. I'm in the middle. I've always been the emotional baggage carrier of the family. There's a lot of mental health issues in my family, a lot of addiction issues, and that's how I grew up. But I also grew up feeling loved. But my dad is an interesting character because he really chose this path of wanting to disconnect from society. He lives very rural. He's pretty self-sufficient. And he chose that when I was 13 years old. My parents got divorced when I was 12, and he sort of chose this life that I think he actually always wanted, but then found himself as a father of two and in a marriage and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot at play there. There's mental health, there's trauma, addiction, all the big players, right? But his defense to all that in life was I'm just going to go disappear. But it's like, but you have these kids, right? And so for us, especially for my younger brother who was 7 at the time, my father bought land. It was fun. We lived really connected to nature. We were there on the weekends. It was great until it wasn't. And I sort of rode this like in between doing all the work. Like he moved away, and when I became an adult, a young adult, and I moved away, it was like I had to call, I had to visit. There was no reciprocal relationship happening because they don't have the internet. They have a cell phone that barely works. Like it's all these pieces that started to make me feel neglected. I'm doing all the work. This is not a reciprocal relationship. But in my young adulthood, I was okay with it because I didn't know any better. And I love my father. And I, with lots of therapy and self work, I did a lot of work around that. And I continued to make myself available, but with boundaries. And then when I had my child and I became a parent is when it all just flooded me, because I was like, wait a minute. How do you turn your back on this? How do you turn your back on this? This is the most incredible, hard, beautiful, bittersweet experience of life. Yeah. And you said, no, I'm good. And for years, I leaned into the excuse of mental health and addiction. But that really started to dissolve because for me, I can't do all the work anymore. I have a child that I'm raising who's amazing that you are also choosing to not have in your life.
Right.
And so I started to create my own boundaries that felt good for me. And then eventually those boundaries have turned into working so hard for a one-sided relationship is not something that I have the capacity for anymore. So I think that boundaries come into play. And I think in a lot of people's experiences, why they choose estrangement is because the boundaries also keep getting violated. My boundaries haven't really been violated. They've just got stronger and stronger because he's not active in that way. You know, there's no contact. But yeah, I think boundaries are a big thing in estrangement. And I wanted to share a definition of estrangement grief from a certified grief counselor that I found online. Their name is Dr. Alexandra Vasquez. And they say, what is estrangement grief and how does it differ? Family conflict and disruption lead many individuals to suffer negative emotions and strained relationships. Estrangement happens when at least one family member distances themselves from their parents, siblings, or both. This can be for lots of reasons, including ongoing conflict, past trauma, discourse within the family dynamic. Estrangement happens in many different ways. Some individuals remove themselves from family conflicts by limiting or stopping communication. This is called going low or no contact. In more extreme cases, others choose to move far away or even change their name to disassociate themselves from the rest of the family. The resulting manifestations of feelings of loss and bereavement are what's known as estrangement grief. The physical, mental, and emotional losses accompanying estrangement within the family mimic the effects of suffering and bereavement, much like when a person you know dies.
Wow.
I like that definition and how they relate it to a death.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it can be.
Yeah, I think, listening to you and kind of thinking about how estrangement has shown up and shows up in our family. So my grandparents got divorced, I think just before I was born. So they made it through a long marriage and then got divorced, and it became like factions. Like we could not have both of them at Christmas. So at first it started where like we'd have my grandma on Christmas Day and my grandpa on Christmas Eve, and then the next year we would swap. And then over the years it just kind of became like my family would just spend both days with my grandma. And my mom, because of her relationship with my grandfather, now I see it and hear it, became estranged from him. It was a very unhealthy relationship. He was very verbally abusive to her. And so she chose to not have a relationship with him. So I didn't have a relationship with him. And then I remember at one point my mom went to help my grandpa. He had a heart attack and was having open heart surgery. I was so confused. I thought we had nothing to do with this human. I'm so confused. And then at another point, he sort of moved into Denver and had never lived close to me my whole life, and suddenly like wanted this relationship with me, of which he had never reached out. He had never tried that. And I remember him creating this nickname. He would call me, very common culturally, still not okay, gordita, and fea, ugly. Like that, those were his nicknames for me. And I remember him calling me that. And I was like, one, I don't fucking know you. Two, those are horrible. And three, I don't want to be around you. I just remember it was the first time I set a boundary, which was like, I have the opportunity to have a relationship with him. He's trying in this kind of fucked up way. He's trying, but I don't want one. But just kind of like how generationally that estrangement is passed on. And if there are experiences where, for example, your dad chose not to have a relationship with your children, if there are times when like the initial relationship is estranged, but then there are kind of secondary relationships that carry on, and kind of how that is complex and navigated.
Yeah, that is not my experience, but I do think a lot of people go through that experience for sure. Yeah, when you zoom out and look at how this affects the lineage, it's big. It can be really big for people.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think about it maybe like when there is addiction and people have very different capacities to
Yes.
engage with that person. And so multiple people sort of in the same line on that genealogical chart have very different interactions and boundaries with that
Yeah.
person. It might exist there a little bit more.
Yeah.
And so I imagine that happens a lot in estrangement grief where it's so there's one story, and I'm thinking of what you were just sharing, Andrea, where it's like, okay, everyone said he was abusive, but now you have this opportunity to see if that's what's true for you, or is that just a narrative that you were told? And then you have the experience of like, yeah, this doesn't feel good, and he is being abusive. And so now I get to choose that I'm not going to be there. But then what happens when people just deny the reality and continue to interact and kind of like what you were saying, Willow, around telling your brother like, okay, get over it, do something about it, where you're suddenly being gaslit
Yeah.
about the need to have a boundary.
Yeah, from like the men in his family, his uncles who he loves and respects,
Right.
And that made me think too, in a context where a family member is abusive, to one generation, and then maybe a family member from the next generation down is like curious, and like what you were sharing,
Mm-hmm.
Andrea, how it makes me think too about the other side of this around the idea that people can heal and they can
Right.
not be
Mm-hmm.
abusive anymore. And what you were speaking to around not being someone who cuts people off, like I sit with that a
Mm-hmm.
lot too, because I don't want to be someone who cuts people off, like, and I want to have good boundaries. And I ultimately do believe in our ability to reform ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And while we may have been abusive at some point in our lives, that we can do the work and heal that.
Mm-hmm.
So that is complex in this too.
Yes, it is. Thank you for naming that.
Yeah, and I feel that I'm sure that my daughter will be curious about
Sure.
my father,
Mm-hmm.
and I keep him very much alive. She knows who he is. She knows why we don't see him right now. She knows why it's complex to a degree that she can understand at her
Mm-hmm.
age. I did take her to see him a lot when she was small, and so we have pictures of him and all of that. But now she's at an age where I can talk about
Mm-hmm.
alcoholism, and I can talk about mental health, and I can talk about why we are in this position. But it's so interesting, just the dynamics of all of it. I always go back to that because I'm just like, it's so wild.
Absolutely.
And grief is like that.
It is.
We always say like it's so individual, yet it's the universal thing.
Right.
Right.
And I think the other side of the estrangement that I was thinking about, like as you were talking about the uncles, is whatever it is. So in this case, if it was like verbal abuse or whatever, oftentimes that person isn't like that with every single person in their life. And so
Exactly.
even when there is a sibling group, two siblings could have experienced that parent very different than the other six siblings.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
the other six siblings have this narrative of he's a great guy, and sure, he had horrible nicknames for all of us, but that was like the extent of it. But it wasn't the reality for those two. And so I think about that a lot because my sister had a very different experience of my grandfather, and her and my another cousin were the first two grandkids, and they sort of had this very magical sort of idealistic grandfather. And I was like, nothing you say resonates with any version of the human being that I knew. And I think because she had heard some of these stories over time from my grandmother, from my mom, from other people, I think she had the background of there is this other side of that person, but she was able to cherish this really special relationship that she had with him. And so that was always interesting to me. Like, wow, we have very different versions of this human being. And you probably think on some level, or maybe have, my boundary with him is really extreme. I don't actually think that she did. She's a very enlightened human being. So she's able to hold multiple realities in a really great way. But I could see how that would impact someone saying, just let it go. It was this one thing.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, he's kind of like that in this way, but it's not like that all the time. Whereas for that person, we don't really know.
Yeah, I think in my family, my father, he's one of 5 children and he's the middle, and he has always been rebellious against everything. That's where a little bit of that comes from in me. I celebrate that. And he always paved his own path. These are things I loved about him. These are the things that put him on the pedestal for me. But now that I am an adult and I have walked my journey, I have so much compassion for him because I'm just like, oh, I know this happened to you. And I know this was never dealt with. And that's when we get into the whole, it's the trauma that leads to this, that leads to that. But it really is that web. So as much as I'm grieving the loss of being in touch and being close and the loss of having the kind of relationship that I thought we would have when I was this far into my adulthood and being a parent myself, it's almost like I love him even more because I'm like, oh, you poor, tender-hearted, sweet human who just did not have the tools. And it's because of the choices he made and his inability to choose something different and choose himself and do his work. It's because of that I did choose those things, you know? So there's a little bit of that in here too, where it's not that I'm grateful for the situation. I would way rather have the deep relationship that I want. But I have also been the person in my lineage that said, fuck no to the continuation of that kind of behavior and those kinds of choices. So it's wild.
It's so wild.
And I do want to quickly speak to divorce because I think that divorce it's such a common experience. And I think that estrangement happens so much in divorce. And when I made an Instagram post about estrangement, and I had so many people message me talking about divorce and estrangement and their grief within that. So as much as it can be rifts in family relationships and fights and mental health and all these things, divorce is actually something that happens, as we know, so commonly that also creates a lot of estrangement. And I also have that experience. My mother was married for 25 years, and my stepfather was a very complicated person, and he was a recovering addict, and the relationship was emotionally abusive, and they finally did divorce. After that, I have never spoken to him again. And that was a relationship that I was in for 25 years.
Right.
And it's not that I wish we spoke. There's a lot of things going on there. I'm glad that we don't, because it wasn't a healthy relationship. And at the same time, I also loved him because he was in my life for 25 years. And I talked to my therapist about this. I'm like, this is so complex that I can love this man who I watched manipulate and abuse my mother and myself and my brother. And yet I still have these complex feelings of love. We are so wild. Our human experience, it just is. That's why I hold a lot of compassion for people who are so stuck in the binary of things. You know, things are this way or that way. And I'm just like, oh, free yourself from that, because it is wildly dynamic and complex to be a human and to be in touch with our emotions and our experiences.
Yeah, it's true. And, you know, when you're feeling into, as you were talking, like there's a shadow and there's a light to these sides of these things. I've said before, whenever I was not as well versed in boundaries, and I knew people who had really strong boundaries, I was like, everybody who's good at boundaries is overly boundaried. They're a no to everything. And I can't even, that's not me. But then not having boundaries, having its own shadow where you're just like, it's fine. I'll always understand. I'm letting this happen. And what's interesting as you're talking about it, and I'm thinking about family dynamics and divorce. And so my parents divorced when I was 8. And my story of it for so many years, it feels really resonant with this piece that you're describing. My parents divorced, and first I had a really cool story. I was like, cool, I'm going to have 2 Christmases and 2 birthdays and 2, like it's going to be party time. And then my dad just disappeared. And it wasn't like he disappeared in the way that you're talking about. He still was supposed to see us, and we would go to his house every other weekend, was sort of what the custody schedule was. And he remarried, and we would go and do the holidays and events. And he would always proclaim how much he loved me. But the relationship and the dad that I knew before my parents divorced and the relationship I had with him after the divorce were so completely different. And it was shocking to my nervous system, because it was that thing that was like, oh, he was able to just walk away and barely see me. He would forget sometimes to come pick us up. And I didn't feel a connection with him. I had this dad who was like the fun guy. My dad was like my safe space. And then they divorced, and then that went away. They had a very contentious divorce. And because we were mostly with my mom, I was hearing her stories too. And I always wondered how that impacted my desire to be connected with him. But what I realized when he died was that thing that you're talking about, all the things that didn't get to happen, that it was, oh, that relationship could never be any different than it was. And I remember telling my brother, I can't wrap my brain around how he walked away. I thought he was attached to me, and I can't wrap my heart around it, was really the thing.
Yeah.
And to have that grief of, I lost him when I was 8, and I didn't actually get to grieve it until he physically died.
Yeah, I really, really relate with that. I think there's a part of me that holds my breath on that exact thing. I do my best to work with my grief. I have my practices. I deal with it. And also, because I live in this world that is so present with death and dying and grief, I mean, it's anticipatory grief is what it is, where I'm just like holding my breath. What's going to happen when he actually does die? Because I know there's floodgates that are just like where the water is just like waiting, and it's surging and it's getting stronger and it's just going to bust down those gates, because there is it's that life. And this happens a lot. A lot of folks who lose their partners to death talk about their grief. And so much of the grief is about the life they're not going to get to live that they thought they were going to get to live with their person. I feel that too. Even though I've been living so much of my adult life without him, I see a blockage, and I see where I don't really allow myself to grieve that yet, and that will come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine, and I don't know that this is necessarily true, but I could imagine in some situations with estrangement, if there is in one of the person's heart some desire for that not to be what the relationship is, that with them alive, you don't grieve it because there's still a hope that there can be a reconnection.
Yeah.
Even if all evidence is to show that there is not going to be, I could understand how you would hold a hope. And I was thinking about that in terms of, I have family members who are not with their birth parents because their birth parents have severe issues with alcohol and drugs. And I know that in their heart, there is this desire to be reconnected with their birth parents, even though they know enough about the scenario to know why that person is not in their life.
Yeah.
But it's their parent. I have so much tenderness in my heart for that desire, whatever that blockage is, to be overcome. Yeah, I hold a lot of tenderness for that, for sure.
Yeah, in researching and reading and listening to other people's stories around this, there are a lot of people out there that do want repair, and they do seek repair. Like I said, there's a bunch of books written about estrangement from the perspective of, you're the parent and your adult child has chosen estrangement. How do I fix it? This is how you fix that. And like in forums and stuff, there was a lot of that. I'm a 65-year-old mother and my daughter has chosen estrangement. How do I heal that? And I really just want to be in her life. So there is that desire for some. And on the, opposite too, maybe it's siblings and one sibling wants to repair. And then there's situations where I know my father will never change. His feet are dug in and he is who he is and he's living the life he's living. And so I don't expect that. I mean, there is that, I am a hopeful person. And so there is like a tiny seed in me that like one day my phone will ring. And
Sure.
but that's okay.
Yes.
I mean, I've sat with family members on the hospice unit that are wishing for that and hoping for that. And it is all happening. The dying is happening in real time. And that's all they want is to like, hear, I love you from my father who never said it. And it is just heart shattering, but it's that I also think it's part of our human condition.
Yeah.
We want to feel loved. We want to feel belonging. It doesn't always happen. And we hope that, and I love the beauty of What Remains so much, how he reflects those stories and he shares that. It's hard to read in moments, but when I was reading it, I was like, oh, I'm so grateful you wrote this book so that people can realize that that's just not how it works,
Yeah, like the Hollywood version of the deathbed is not like
Right. It's like, oh gosh, Andrea, that's so true. It feels like the Hollywood version of the Disney princess thing. And we're like, I believe this. And that we have this unconscious belief about that is not reality.
It is in the Hollywood movies where a terminal illness happens, and then they're slowly dying throughout the whole movie. The whole family comes, everyone repairs. It's so neat and tidy. And it's like, I cringe.
Now I do too.
It does not look like that.
Well, you brought something up a bit ago that I wanted to also just explore a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit contradictory to what we're talking about in terms of your dad's not going to change. And we also are saying you can hold that people change and like sometimes estrangement could happen or there could be repair. I mean, if these books were written, I'm just like, oh, that's hopeful that people are like seeking a book that says, how do I repair?
Yeah.
But here's what I think for myself often too, because of the part of me I don't do cutoffs. I mean, I read more about forgiveness than I read about boundaries. And so I need both. But whenever I'm reading about forgiveness and there's parts of me that are like, this is who I am. And so I don't want to hold on to a grudge. And that's what's hard with boundaries. I'm setting this boundary because this is what you've done or this is how you are. And then I'm like, but I don't want to cast you in stone or say that that's forever. And so what I had to get to within myself, because I was exploring this constantly in therapy sessions and with multiple like healers and people I knew in my life, I was like, but am I being stubborn? Is there a point where I need to be softer? And I came up with for myself, I was like, what conditions would need to happen for me to actually know that I was safe in that relationship? And truthfully, I'm like, it's 2 years of this person being kind to me in a way that feels congruent and consistent over time. And if they can't do that, it's like every time it happens again, the clock starts over. Yeah. But I think it's an important question. And I don't know if you've ever asked yourself that around your dad or if you've just come across it in terms of, in the estrangement piece of what conditions can help change and how do we trust that?
Yeah, I ask myself that a lot around my internal questioning of, can I go see him? Because I'm always invited to show up. It's like, I'm here. That's his stance, right? But can I go see him with my daughter now? She's older. I went when she was a baby. I went multiple times a year. When she was a toddler, I went. We have not seen him since she was 4. And she's turning 9. So I asked that question around that. And in my particular situation, because I have no idea what's going on there, and I can only assume that it's the same behaviors, And it's not like when I go there, it's a volatile situation, but it's my father in his addictions,
Mm-hmm.
in this lifestyle that he's chosen. And I now have a very awake and alert 9-year-old child. And
Mm-hmm.
I have asked, hey, when we come, can you change this and maybe not do this? And that is shut down. No, this is my house and my place, and I'm going to do what I want to do.
Mm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I have this unique situation in that I don't really have a window into like what is happening there.
Mm-hmm.
But I can say for a long time, when I started to do my own boundary work, I was maybe one of those people that was holding very strong boundaries all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I realized boundaries don't have to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
They can be really fluid, and they can reflect what is the current in this present moment situation, what is going on here.
Mm-hmm.
I really love where you got to with yourself, where you're like 2 years of kind behavior, you know, and if not, you start over. It reminds me of the no complaining for 21 days. And if you complain, you have to start over, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard.
I'm not ever signing up for that challenge.
Yeah, I did when I was like, I tried it many times.
Yeah.
Not anymore. But so I think I work with it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a little bit of a mystery going on. I haven't landed on an answer. I don't know if it's a safe environment right now,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so I just continue to stay away, even though part of me wants to go,
Mm-hmm.
obviously. And I think too, I was going to say, and I think this fits in here. I do a lot of work with my like inner parts around this.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, I have a relationship with all my selves going on here, and I really try to be present to that. And so it is so my inner teenage girl that wants to be with her dad, who was so much fun. We had the best conversations. We made the greatest food together. He listens to amazing music. The influence that he had on me and who I am today, it's powerful and it's strong. I am proud to be his daughter in my core, because I think he's a really fascinating person. And then there's the littler girl in me that grieves his disappearance.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tend to her. And then there's the mother in me that I am right now that is angry and is like, what the fuck?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
I have this amazing kid that you're missing out on.
Mm-hmm.
Because you created this very strong stance that if we want to be in relationship to you, we have to come to you. And that's totally
Mm-hmm.
not realistic. That's not how relationships work,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So I have found that really being able to break down how I'm feeling in relation to the parts of myself that are feeling that is also sort of my boundary work in a sense, if that makes sense, you know, because I'm able to sort of work with the boundaries that I need to have to support each of the selves that is having this different relationship with the whole experience of being estranged.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious because you mentioned it, the grief practices that you have around estrangement grief. And I would love if you could share, some way that you do that, just for our listeners, even to really consider how they might adopt some practices in their own lives.
Yeah, so I do a lot of ritual work, and I believe that ritual is just defined as anything we do with intention. It doesn't have to be this like thing.
Mm-hmm.
Your ritual every day can be washing the dishes if you're doing it with intention and presence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we make a big thing out of ritual. It is a big thing, but I think it can be a really simple thing. And so in general, when I'm present with my grief, specifically around this estrangement, really missing him, birthdays, you know, certain times of the year, I will really feel him and feel my connection or lack of connection with him. I spend a lot of time in nature. I happen to live somewhere where I can go and walk by the ocean, which is like a huge piece for me, or be in the forest. I listen to the music that I was raised on by him, which can stir a lot of emotions, but I like that, and it's important for me. I'll listen to songs that will make me cry and make me really think about him, and that is a really good release for me. Cooking is huge. He taught me how to cook. He is an amazing cook. And so I will cook certain dishes that come through me from him. And again, I will cry into the pot because the music will be on. Sometimes I do all these things at once and it's a lot. My husband's like, whoa, what's going on in here? And so I'm thinking about dad. And he's like, okay, you know. And back to the parts work, you know, I will hold and be really tender with the parts of myself that are needing that. I've also found a lot of relief in the practice of writing him letters that I don't send and then I burn. Or, you know, I have that disappearing paper that disappears in water and just put it in there. And then I have spent my adult life actively creating a strong network of chosen family. And I lean into that. And I have men in my life who remind me a lot of all the good parts of him. And so spending time with those friends, allowing myself to be fathered by one of my best friend's husbands who I love so much and reminds me so much of my dad, that can be really, really supportive and healing for me. And sometimes it's as simple as I am feeling this in this moment and lighting a candle for that thing. And just allowing that candle to hold vigil for me while I'm in that head and heart space of feeling. So those are some of the things I do. And then talking about it, you know.
I think it's so important and it's helpful to hear always, to hear how other people are sort of metabolizing their grief, honoring their grief, making space for it, because it's one of the things we can do in a situation that can feel where we feel so powerless and lost.
Well, we feel alone and we feel like it's only happening to me. And the reality is it's happening to so many of us. And that normalizing, I feel like I say that a lot, but we have to normalize these things. We have to normalize our grief. And the only way to do that is to talk about it. That's why community is so important. And when it comes to gathering people together, I've never separated losses out. I've never done like just a death loss group or just a estrangement group, because I like the mix of humans together in their losses, because we have so much to reflect and learn from each other. And even though the type of loss may be different, the details around the loss may be different, so much of what we're feeling and what we're going through is universal. And it's my favorite moment is when I witness people in a grief circle nodding their heads and as people are speaking. And I know that their losses are totally different, but they're seeing themselves in each other. And that is the healing moment. Even if it just is like 1 second of being seen. It's everything.
Yeah.
It really is. It's so powerful. And so I think coming together and being open too, you know, not all of us have big community. You don't have to have big community. One person, one friend, just one human that will listen to you. And so I also think that making sure that we are working on how we listen to each other and being more present with each other, because it's hard. It takes work to be present these days. And so I just encourage people to really work on that. Because there's power in being a good listener and a good receiver.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think I've talked about this before, but one of the other things, and we'll, you know, link to all of your socials and stuff. When I was going through infertility, I felt really alone. I didn't know anybody in my peer network who was currently going through it, and only knew like 2 people professionally who had done it. And I wasn't about to be like, let's get into the nitty gritty of how shitty this is. And I found this online community that I contributed to, that I drew from. And it was really beautiful. So, for listeners out there who either don't know who to turn to with their grief, are not ready to kind of be open with the folks who are in their life, I think there is a shadow side to the anonymity of online presence, but there also is this beauty of being able to connect with people specifically around this thing. And so, we'll definitely point them towards you. And there are people talking about this and connecting about it. And that can be sort of an easy entry point into it, where you can be an observer and see things and have your experiences reflected. And then at your pace, you can kind of jump in.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I will offer some estrangement specific groups just because I see a need. And in any kind of group offering, it's so important as a facilitator, I think, to make sure that everything is presented as an invitation. If you come to a grief circle, you don't have to say a word. You can sit and just observe the whole thing, and your presence means something, and we want you there, and then, like you said, take your time. Maybe you come again, maybe share your name, maybe you share what your loss is, and that's it. Just taking baby steps. And because it's hard to be vulnerable and it's hard to share yourself with strangers. And so, yeah, just working at your own pace and finding ways to soothe yourself as you're opening yourself up, to others.
Yeah, I love that. It's true. I'm noticing the time, so we probably need to wrap up. But Willow, thank you so much for coming today and sharing your story and being so vulnerable and just being who you are in the world. And if our listeners want to find Willow online, you can go to Instagram and find her at onepreciouslife_companioning. And also you can find the work she's doing with Tracy Chalmers, her co-creator of The Grief Well, at The Grief Well Village. And Willow and I are co-hosting an online group going through the book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Weller. It'll be an 8-week group. You can find the details in our show notes as well.
And then I'll send you guys, I have some estrangement resources, some good websites that I found. And I did want to mention there's a really wonderful US-based organization called Together Estranged, and they focus on providing free support services to adults estranged from family members, and their priorities are female identifying individuals, the LGBTQ plus community, the BIPOC and Indigenous people of color, and they're working to meet the needs of estranged folks, both before they've advanced into full estrangement, during the process, and long after. And I wanted to mention that because estrangement happens a lot for people in the queer community. Yeah. But that is a huge demographic that's happening.
Absolutely.
In a big way. So
thank you for that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Willow, for that information. Yes, everyone, please check out our show notes for this episode. They're going to be pretty robust, I have a feeling. And this is the part where we check out Willow and we check out with how we're touching into our grief. So we're going to invite you to join if you'd like. Yeah, Andrea, how are you touching into your grief this week?
The way that I've been touching into my grief this week, I listened to a couple of kind of back to back. I think I had gotten a little bit behind on Anderson Cooper's podcast. So I listened to one where he interviewed Ashley Judd, whose mom, Wynona Judd, died by suicide. Ugh. It feels recent, like within the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, wasn't it?
It was 2022, I believe.
Yeah. And it was a really cold, cold day. I think it was right around the time we were first supposed to record, Willow, and you were having like an Arctic fucking freezes the internet, and we were having super cold. But I'm like an obsessive dog mom. And so I was like, well, it's warm enough to walk my dog, so I'm still going to walk my dog. And I was listening and crying. It was such a beautiful episode to hear Ashley Judd talk about her mom's ongoing battle with mental illness, the shock and loss of being the one to find her mother, the sort of integration of her life post her mom, always woven in with the tenderness of Anderson Cooper, who lost a brother by suicide. it was just so beautiful. And I was like walking in the freezing cold crying, and I got home and I had tears frozen underneath my eyelashes. But it was a really, really beautiful heart opening episode. And Ashley Judd is just like a ethereal kind of being. Like, I don't really know much of her. I think I've, probably seen her in movies and kind of knew she was an advocate, but it was really beautiful. So as always, I recommend his podcast, but it was a very tender episode.
Thank you for sharing that. I'll have to go and listen to it. I haven't heard that one yet. Willow, what about you? I mean, we're just launching you right into our practice, but I trust that you're constantly in touch with grief.
I love
And
that.
so how have you been in touch with grief this week?
This week, well, I also listened to the same podcast episode. Am I allowed to say the same thing?
Yes, absolutely.
All the things that you said resonated, and also a moment in that particular episode that I loved. And I knew that Ashley Judd was like our people when Anderson choked up, as he often does. And every time he does, I do too. She was like, "I'm right here, Anderson. I'm right here with you. Thank you." And she thanked him for his vulnerability, and she stayed with him. I was like, Ashley Judd. Like,
I was like, is she a therapist? I mean, I was like,
do you want to facilitate grief circles? Because you would be amazing.
Oh, I love that.
I had the same thought.
It was so beautiful.
It was, yeah. She was, it was so because Rebecca and I talk a lot about like, just cry, Anderson, like, because he apologizes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what it was. He apologized, and she said, don't apologize.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I'll share too how I'm touching into my grief this week. So it's interesting. I mean, I'm touching into grief, not in the way that I think I typically think about it, where I feel like, oh, I want to have a good cry or I feel the actual grief, but in this way of really, I've been thinking a lot about resources and ways that I could create different offerings that can help people in their grief. And I feel like I've had all this creative energy around grief happening this week. So I've just been doing a lot of writing and trying to just capture it all before it leaves me and finds someone else, because I think creativity kind of works like that too. And it's like, look, this thing wants to be born in the grief world. If you're not going to do it, we're going to go give it to somebody else. And I'm like, wait, let me get a pen. So that's what's been up for me.
I love that. I love that. Well, Willow, I just want to echo Rebecca. Thank you so much. I feel just so open-hearted and connected, and so glad to be hearing your voice. It's amazing. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for spending time with us. And
of course, anytime.
Thank you both. Love you both.
Love you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at All the Grief Pod. And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.